And what's on the docket today? We are going to start with fractions, decimals, and percents. Actually, Emily's going to kick us off. Then we're going to go into sentence correction verbs. I'll take over at that point. Critical reasoning, draw a conclusion. And finally, a quick follow-up on the email I sent today about now that you've taken a couple of practice exams, ideally, what do you do with that information and any other information about how you've been doing so far. So with that, I will kick it to Emily.
All right, thanks, Chris. And we lumped these topics together because, as you certainly know, they all refer to parts of things, just different ways of expressing part of a whole, less than an integer. And you could probably add to this scientific notation, and I think we'll touch on that tonight as well. So, what's going to be our goal? A little bit different tonight. Since this is the math that is most likely most familiar to most people, even if you didn't study math in college and avoided that assiduously, you probably still use this stuff in your everyday life. So, what we're going to aim for is speed and ease of calculation. We're going to show you some tricks, some shortcuts that incidentally would also make it a little bit easier to avoid some of the traps. Even though the math might be a little bit more familiar, traps are there. They're laid by the GMAT test writers. So that will be our focus as we discuss, with the goal of adding some time to the bank. If you're going to see about a fifth of the problems on this test as FDPs and can shave a minute off of half of them, that's time that can be spent on things like word translations that tend to take a little bit more time. So, with that in mind, we're going to actually do batches of 3 problems so that you can practice a little bit managing your time over more than one problem. And I'm going to push a little on the time and give you only 5 minutes, which is a little less than standard. So when you have answers to all 3, give us a green check. Just hang on to your answers on your paper. We'll pull for the actual responses later on. Okay, so that was 5 minutes for 3 problems. Go ahead and give me a green check mark if you're on the last one, even if you're not quite done. And I'll pull for your answers on these one by one. Okay, looks like most of you are on that last problem at least. So let's look at these. Change the poll in here. Please enter your answer for this one with the buttons. Wait for those to roll in there. Answers, please. And look at that. Everybody who was here to work on this has given the same answer. So what I'm really interested in then is, what were your methods? Type in to everybody, and I'd like to hear from you all, please. What was your method? Did you do algebra? Did you have some sort of shortcut? Give us just a sense for what you did. Okay, so two methods being suggested here, and let's just get them up on the board quickly. One of the methods is to pick a smart number, and you guys are suggesting what I think is the smartest of numbers for a percent problem, 100, because pretty much the percents they're going to give you are going to be neat. They certainly are here, 10%. So it's straightforward to calculate those numbers and figure out what the new price is going to be. The second discount, here's where I like this method quite a bit, is to catch the fact that the second discount of 10% isn't equivalent to the first. It's on a smaller amount, and so you end up with a price that's $81. And then you figure out, okay, that's $19 reduced. And several of you are typing in this. Since you guys were mostly in agreement on this one, I'll put it up here quickly. That you could multiply 0.9 times 0.9. In other words, the price after the discount each time. And realize that, like, if the original price was X, the final price would be 0.81X. And you're right to recognize you need to subtract that from 1, the original price. So the correct answer is B. Raise your hand if you can tell me what the trap answer is here. Answer or answers? Okay, so Danielle, why do you say A?
Because I guess one could easily just make the mistake of adding those 2%, but which would mean not taking into account that the 10% you're taking is also a smaller amount.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that anytime you see successive percents, one taken after another, whether it's up or down, discount or increase, you should be on the lookout for this trap, which is the temptation to just simply add them. Yeah, and Chris was asking a great question. What do you all think about that? What happens after 10% down followed by 10% back up? Okay, so what does that lead to? Yeah, Andrew is absolutely right. 99, right? You lop off $10 from the original 100, but then you only get 9 back. And this is a lesson I think we're all learning in the stock market, if you are one of us. One of the people affected by that. And so you have to actually see a bigger gain to get back to where you started after a big drop like that. All right. How about this one? Clear in answers right now. Go ahead and give me your responses here. Okay, I'm going to call on someone for approach. Amit, would you grab the mic and talk about how you got your response?
Yeah, I use X as a capacity for drum X and Y to represent the capacity or the quantity of oil in the other drum. And I set up an equation that Y is equal to 2X, and the current capacity of drum X is the quantity of oil in drum X is X by 2. So when oil from drum X is transferred to the other, the total would be 4 by 3. 2 by 3 into 2x plus x by 2, which would result in 11.
I don't know if anybody else was having trouble hearing Amit, like having it cut out. Just smile if you also were. I think maybe he's having some connection problems there. Okay, so it wasn't just me. I was sort of following what he did, but it sounds like a straight-up algebra approach. And actually I wanted to talk about that. I've got an approach up here. Let me just say right off the bat that Amit got this one right by doing algebra. And here's another algebra solution. Here's an equation basically to keep track of the relative size of those drums. And Danielle, you're saying, I'm not totally comfortable. Well, check out my math. Tell me what you think about it, everyone. Here's where I'm adding up the oil. Half full in X, 2/3 full in Y. And you've got to, account for the fact that they have different sizes. So I did that with substitution. I substituted for Y in that second row here. Then it's basically a fraction problem. 2/3 times 2 is 4/3. I've got to go to a common denominator, and I get E as the answer. What do you all think? If someone wants to respond to this, raise your hand. Let's see if someone on the mic. Hey Danielle, looks like you grabbed the mic, but we didn't hear you. Go ahead, try that again.
Oh, wait, what you mean? So you said you got E, right? I mean, with that math. So I think the problem is, let's see, I also, I added, I guess, 1/2 X plus 4/3 X. So then that's 6X plus 8/6X, 11/6X, but then you have to put it over 2X because they're asking you for what fraction it is of Y, not of X. I think that's the problem.
That is exactly the problem. Here's the danger with the algebraic method. Not only do you add fractions, which is annoying to a lot of people, but you also have to keep track of, fractions are meaningless without knowing what fraction of what. And it's very easy to lose track of whether it's fraction of X or fraction of Y. And I made the mistake here of calculating the fraction of X. My math was absolutely correct, but I answered the wrong question, essentially. So this, I think, is the danger in this approach. Plus, it's kind of confusing. So what's an alternative to this? It's noteworthy, too, that E was up there as an answer. What if you did something different from algebra? Wow, you guys all did algebra. I'm shocked by that. What could we do to think about oil in non-fractional terms? Like, yeah, so how would you use numbers, Amit? You went to algebra immediately, but you know that numbers would work too. Talk us through that. Yeah, I'm not hearing you on the mic. Go ahead and grab the mic. That'll be faster. Yeah, common multiple of 6. And by the way, here's just a little tip. Anytime they talk about something that's realistic, draw it, because even a picture alone would help quite a bit here. So I visually can track the fact that Y is twice as large as X. I don't run any risk of confusing which one's the bigger one and which one's the smaller one. And it's here that we can apply the smart number strategy. Pick a number of 6, as Amit suggests, because it's the multiple of, the common multiple of these denominators. By using 6, we guarantee ourselves that no matter which fraction we take, even if we take both of these fractions out of it, we're still going to get an integer result. And by doing that, we don't have to deal with the fractions throughout the problem. That means the smart number for Y is 12. And you can actually draw your oil in there at about 1/2 and about 2/3 full. Again, just to keep track of what's what. And that means that there's 3 gallons or whatever of oil in X, and there are 8 in Y. Plus, you can physically track the pouring of it and realize that there are 11 total after that's poured. So that's 11 out of 12, and there's your answer. So C is the right answer, and you guys mostly got it. I suspect if you picked a different answer, it was for the reason I showed you over here, doing algebra and picking an answer that actually shouldn't make sense. Why do I say this answer shouldn't make sense, even though there's a mathematical reason to get it? Look back at this from a guessing perspective. What do the answers tell you, and how do the answers help you? Or how might they? Improper fraction. An improper fraction, remember, is a number that is larger than 1. Numerator greater than denominator. And D and E both are larger than 1. In other words, it's filled to more than capacity. And you can't have that. It would be spilling over. So these answers don't match the common sense test. Okay. All right. This number is even higher. So yeah, they may not have felt like hard problems, but sometimes the ones that don't feel hard are. Give me your answers on this one. All right. So could we use Amit's suggestion from the last problem and say, okay, there are all these fractions in here. Just look at all the denominators and pick a smart number of 20. What do you guys think? Smile or thumbs down on that? Rosie's saying it seems reasonable. Right? Same as before. Andrew, you're saying no, though. Andrew, grab the mic. Tell us why not.
Well, they give you a number in this, and so therefore, I guess you use only smart numbers when you're only dealing with fractions or percentages, but because they're giving you a real number, that is not applicable.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Whenever they give you a non-fraction, a whole number of things, you are constrained to pick numbers that would jive with that. And watch how our smart number of 20 doesn't. 1/5 A's means 4 A's. 1/4 B's, that's 5 B's. There'd be half C's. So that's 19 total, which implies that there's only one grade that would be a D. But of course, that's less than what they've told us, so our number's way too small. And so picking a number on something like this is sort of tantamount to trying to guess the answer or work backward from the answer choices, which wouldn't be a terrible way to go. But what is the alternative? What's the other method? John Laurent, I see you typing. Do you have a mic today?
Yeah. I don't know if I got this right actually, because you didn't say what the answer was, but I didn't pick a smart number, but I picked a common denominator for the 1/5, 1/4, and 1/2 there of 20. And then if you add all those together, you find out that the remainder, those with a grade of D, is the proportion is 1/20th, and 1/20th equals to 10. So then all you have to do is multiply 10 by 20, and that's what I did.
Yeah, that's pretty much what you have to do. You have to add up all these fractions and see how much of the total of the class that is. And then you can sort of back into, well, what fraction is left over. And so our smart number that we tried to use earlier isn't gone to waste here because we're adding 1/5, and the common denominator is 20. So we can add those 4, 5, and 10 in the numerators. But what that implies is that 1/20th of the grades are D's. So 1/20th of X, the total number of people in the class, would give you 10, the total number of D's. And as John Laurent pointed out, that means 20 times 10 is our answer. X equals 200. And D is the right answer. You guys mostly nailed this one. In fact, you all did. Yes. So Chris is making a really important point here. Fractions only make sense if you know what it's a fraction of. And so if you're thinking in your head, it's 1/20th of the grades, put some variable to represent how many grades there are. Always put that variable. Because after all, it's the thing you're solving for. You might do that at the beginning, recognizing the question. What's the number of students? X equals the number of students. So you are conscious of the need to insert that somewhere in your math. Great point. So our takeaway from this set is that even mundane problems can be made a little bit easier by means of some non-standard techniques. I think we probably all learned in school how to do this oil problem with algebra. And so that's the default for a lot of people, but on this test it's all about timing, right? So feel free to take shortcuts like this. In fact, we actively encourage it. Just know when you can't do that is when they give you actual numbers. We saw why on that last problem. All right, let's move on to another set, and I'm going to push you again. 5 minutes for this one, and give me a green check when you're done. Okay, so that's 5 minutes, and I've got 4 checks in from people. Give me a green check if you're on the last one at least. And just now working to finish that up. I would like to keep us moving, so even if people aren't done, I'd like to get into the discussion of it. It will help me also to know which of these 3 did you guys think was toughest. You could just type in top, middle, or bottom. I'd like to hear from everybody just to see what the consensus is. All right, so it looks like the bottom one is giving you guys the most trouble, which is funny because look at the number on this one, number 8. So this is something we've mentioned to you before, like you just can't tell how hard or easy a problem is. Because it's not how hard or easy it is to do or how many steps it takes. Its ranking according to the GMAT is based on how many people get it right and how many people get it wrong. So a low number in the OG means a lot of people will get this one right. But it may still be difficult to do. Whereas earlier problems that we saw had high numbers, but you guys seem to breeze right on through them. But maybe other people make the trap mistakes and fall for it, and therefore you will steal points on problems like those. So let's look at how you can make this one easier to deal with. Go ahead and give me your answers on this first one. Looks like that one was the least work for everybody. Was the least work. All right, fantastic. And we have unanimity on this one around the correct answer, which is 3. So what did you guys do? What was your method? Catherine, what did you do?
Since they asked for what the expression is approximately equal to, I simply simplified the numbers and made it 60 times 1 divided by 20, which leads to 60 divided by 20, which is about 3.
Yeah, give us a big old smile if you did it pretty much exactly the same way. And look at that. It's a natural way to go on this one. Anytime they tell you they're looking for an approximate answer, there's your clue that you should approximate as well. Plus the numbers themselves just are too close to really round numbers and insignificantly different enough to be annoying numbers that it makes sense to just round them to those nice numbers. Great job on this one. Yeah, I don't know why it even ranks this high. It's still relatively early in the book. It's Q in the quant book. Let's take a look at this one. What are your answers here? Hold on, let me clear the polling and go ahead and give me your answer now. Just waiting for a couple of responses. Danielle, Ganesh, I don't have yours. Angela, you may have just come back. Give an answer if you've got one. Okay, great. And we're completely unanimous on the correct answer here, which is B. So let's step back for a second, though. Let's pretend you didn't have time to do this one. What did the answer choices tell you? What do you guys notice about these? And I want a hand to be raised here. I want someone on the mic. Think about it also. How might you guess if you had no time to do it? Ryan, what do you think?
I don't think it could be D or E because it's 1 being divided by something, so D and E are saying that the answer is greater than 1.
Yeah, perfect, right? Even if you didn't have time to deal with this whole mess over here, it indicates that it's 1 plus a little bit, so the denominator is bigger than 1. Straight up elimination of D and E because they're too big. There's another reason those choices should be noteworthy to you. The fact that B and D are exact inverses of each other, and so are A and E. Why do you think they are pairing answers like this? And by the way, since C is not paired with anything in that same way, in a guessing situation it makes sense to get rid of that one too. Why are they pairing them like this? Rosie, what do you think it has to do with inverses? All right, looks like maybe Rosie didn't catch my question there. Let me get somebody on the mic. Ganesh, how did you work your way through this one? Just go over the math for us really quickly. I seem to be calling on people who've stepped away and seem to be here but aren't. All right, since you guys got this, I will quickly give you a little tip here. Okay, Rosie, you're here. My question to you was like, I'll have you field both of those. Why did they pair the answers like this, where they're inverses? And also, walk us through the actual steps.
Okay, first of all, I'm not really sure about the why they're paired like 3/10 and 10/3. I mean, it's I actually don't really have the answer to that. Emily, maybe I'm not thinking through it, but just to walk through the process of doing the problem, I started off with the denominator of the denominator that's in the denominator. So it's 2 plus 1 over 3 is the same as 7 over 3 if you could convert it into a fraction. And then 1 over 7 over 3 is the same as 1 times the inverse of 7 over 3, which is 3 over 7. And then when you add 1 to that, you get 10 over 7. You convert 1 into a fraction, which is 7 over 7. So you have the common denominator, plus 3 over 7, which is 10 over 7. And then 1 over 10 over 7 would be the same as 1 multiplied by the inverse of 10 over 7, which is 7/10. And that gives you the answer B.
Yeah, precisely. So you even said the reason why why we see inverses in the choices here. You use the inverse trick. If you have to basically work your way out of this problem, figuring out the most complicated part first, converting that to 7/3, there's a shortcut that you took at this step where you said 1 over a fraction can be just written very quickly as the inverse of that fraction. So you just flipped it. It's that flipping step that you did a couple times in this problem that is baking in trap answers in the choices we see here. Because how would you get D as an answer? Well, you'd get it right here at this next to last step in the problem. So I think this problem is as high numbered as it is because it's a problem where it's possible to lose track of where you are in the problem. And so what I've tried to model for you guys is what I think is good scrapboard technique. Try to avoid writing a problem over and over again, like rewriting at every step. If it is a multi-stage problem, try to write it big once and then sort of solve in place. You'll eliminate some of the typo-type errors that can be introduced. All right, so this is the last one, the one that gave you guys a lot of trouble. Pull in your answers while Chris grabs the mic and adds something here.
Yep, while you pull in your answers, I'll just go back quickly. I give this idea a name so that I remember it. It's called scribble math. And scribble math is you write it big once and then you circle the things as you go and write this right next to it. And you might even scribble this out, which is the kind of thing you were never allowed to do in grade school. When you did problems like this, you couldn't turn in your paper with circles all over it and equal 7/3, etc. But it's a great way to keep track of where you are on paper. So if you didn't learn it before, learn it now because you want to be both fast and accurate. If you get seduced by, oh, I can just flip these things around in my head, then you're going to fall for the trap of picking 10/7 because you thought you did all the flips but you forgot to do the last one or something akin to that. So use scribble math where you jot it down on paper, not in a form you could turn it into your grade school math teacher, but in a form that you can absolutely assuredly keep track of where you are, and yet you aren't writing it out every single step as if you're turning it in to that teacher, because that'll take too long.
All right, good point. So on this one, some of you didn't enter an answer. I'll give you a last chance to do that. I'm assuming if you didn't, maybe it's because you didn't get to an answer on this one. And in fact, we're a little bit all over the place, so further evidence that you guys struggled with this one. Anybody feel maybe 80% confident on their approach? Raise your hand so I don't call on someone who is like, oh, I just guessed. Danielle, go ahead.
I think I have the right answer, but I was going to ask a question about it. It took me like a really long time to do the math, which I'm wondering maybe there's some simpler way. Let's see, so I came up with the equation 138 equals 0.82x. So that would be that 138 billion is 82% of the capacity of the reservoir, which I assigned x. So then I solved for x, and that's what took me a while, just because I'm very slow at math. So I realized that wasn't coming out to an exact answer, and then I realized that in the question it said approximately. So that comes out to around 168. So that would be like around 168 billion, which would be the capacity. And then I subtracted 124 from that, and that was 44 billion, and that's the answer, because they're asking how many billion gallons were the reservoir short of total capacity prior to the storm.
Okay, Danielle, I think you've hit the nail on the head with what is difficult about this problem. I think there are two steps that are hurdles. One is extracting the formula out, or the equation out of the language, right? And I think a picture will help if that's where people got stuck. Draw your reservoir. They talk about a certain water level to begin with. They talk about rain, a level to be that it ended at, before and after. Put your numbers next to it, because then you can actually picture it. And you can also then have a place to sort of keep track of, well, I'm going to need the total, because they ask about how far short were we of the total capacity. So that tells you need to set up a variable for that. And that's exactly where Danielle took us. She said, okay, what do we know about that total? 138 is 82% of it. So there's the equation that you can pull out. But that second hurdle is the computation here. And I might have missed it. How did you determine that this was around 168? You said it took a long time. Was it long division? Or, okay, so Danielle did this by long division. Let me throw this out to the group. What might we do that would be faster than long division? Okay, so we can make it a little bit shorter by getting rid of the decimal. If you move it over on top and on bottom, you're okay. But still long, yeah, I agree. Ooh, John Laurent, you're typing in a really interesting comment. Grab the mic and get us going with that. I think you raised your hand instead of clicking on the mic. Go ahead and click on that audio button.
Sorry about that. I basically, I had the same equation, and then I couldn't figure it out by long division, so I just saw that 82 was about 4/5. And then, so I basically figured out that 4/5 of 138 would be, if you round up 140 to 140, it would be about 35. And then this is really rough, so I figured out that the total capacity would be around 175. And I tried to pick the closest number to that one. I did, 175 or less, 124. And that was actually 51, but 44 was the closest number.
Yeah, I think this is really a neat way to go. And Chris is filling in the blanket for us in the chat window. He's saying, why 4/5? It's because its decimal equivalent is 0.8, which is obviously close to 0.82. And there's a lot of sense in changing decimals into fractions whenever there's like division involved. The main reason is that if you're going to divide by a fraction, it's like multiplying by the inverse. Fractions are nice because they allow you to be lazy. You can cancel as much as possible before actually doing the calculation. And Jean Laurent recognized that to fully implement our laziness, we're going to need something that's divisible by 4, a rounder number than 138. Now, 140 works. It allows you to say, hey, that's going to reduce. 140 over 4 is like 35, and then you're left to do 35 times 5, which we're going to find is about 175. Not quite at the 168 that Danielle figured out, but close enough. It's enough to figure out that the answer has to be E, which is the highest value up there, because 168 minus 124 gave us 44. We're estimating a little high here, and that's okay, because the answer still would have to be that highest one. How could we avoid estimating too high or too low? Can anyone refine this estimation for us? Razi, what do you mean compensate? Grab the mic.
What I mean by compensate is if you're gonna estimate or approximate the numerator and denominator, then one thing you could do is estimate down the numerator and estimate up the denominator, or the other way around. I would go with the first one. So if we want to do it, x equals 138 over 0.82, so we could say like 135 divided by 0.8, which would be 135 times, and divided by 4/5, which equals 135 times 5 over 4.
Yeah, great. If we round the denominator down, we are dividing by a smaller number, which makes the overall a little bigger than it otherwise would have been. If we round the numerator up, we're compounding that overstatement. Yeah, so we actually want to, in a quotient like this, we want to round them both the same way. So a slightly closer approximation would have been something like this, 136. And I'm picking that instead of the 135 you just said, Razi, just because I know it's divisible by 4, which is what we're going to end up canceling it with. And so 136 divided by 4 to cancel is actually, gosh, 34. Yeah, and so 34 times 5 is a little closer this time. 170-ish. You'll notice I'm not even doing that all that closely, but it gets us closer to the true answer. How do you guys feel about this? Does this explanation resolve some of the issues you had? I suspect setup and also just the ugliness of the numbers. And hey, Catherine told us earlier, when they tell you approximate, do it. It's embedded in here. They actually want us to approximate here as well. The clue was there. So there's our takeaway. When they tell us to approximate, we do it. And don't lose sight of approximation as a tool. Even when they don't say approximate, for any time when the math is just a little bit tricky but could be made easier by judicious and compensating rounding, as we saw here. And don't forget that little shortcut we used on that fraction problem. Pause here for comments, but let's keep on moving if you guys are okay with that. And the next set is going to have to do with powers of 10. So I just want to remind you of a couple things on this, since it may have been a while. When you multiply by a power of 10 that has a positive exponent on it, that equates to lots and lots of zeros. You're multiplying by a big number. And what that means is you'll move the decimal place to the right in the thing that you're multiplying with. So in this case, 3 to the right makes this 3,846. And the opposite is true when you multiply by a negative power of 10. That's like dividing by a big number. So you move the decimal place the other way. And here's a little sleight of hand that you might find useful on certain problems. If you want to rewrite the form of a product like this, such that you're turning it into, say, scientific notation, where there's only one digit in front of the decimal place. If you're going to move this decimal place to the left, don't move this decimal place to the left and make this 10 to the first. If you do that, you're making both numbers smaller and you're changing the overall value. What you want to do is account for the fact that you've moved this one left by moving this one right. So in other words, 10 to the 3 becomes 10 to the 5th, and vice versa. If you move the decimal place on this one to the right, you move the decimal place on this one to the left. you might see a chance to use that on the set that's coming up. And here it is. So give me a green check when you're finished. I'm going to give you 5 minutes again. There you go. Okay, I have checks from half of you. Green check now if you're on the last one. The same question again. Which one was toughest here? Top, middle, or bottom? Everyone weigh in on this. All right, so everybody's saying bottom except Ganesh who's saying top. So Ganesh, you don't like this top one. Everybody's in agreement at least on this one, at least with the official guide assessment of it. Look how high that number is. Danielle didn't like the first one either. So let's look at this one. Yeah, there's trickiness in every single one. I'm going to change the polling. Go ahead and give me your answers on this one. We'll see if everybody else's confidence on this one is justified. All right, Brooks, don't have an answer from you. Ganesh, go ahead and give your answer on this one. You said you struggled with it, but that's all right. Well, check this out. Only Danielle and Ganesh said they struggled, but we have some disagreement here. No matter what the answer is, there's going to be a number of people who missed it. So, how'd you do it if you didn't have any trouble with this one? Danielle, I'd love to hear what you did wrong. Let's look at track answers in just a moment. Actually, you want to grab the mic and tell us where you went wrong initially?
Oh, I got E 66%, but I realized when you put the polling up, and I assumed D had to be the right answer because the majority got D, and when I looked back at it, I mistakenly used 1 million rather than 10 million.
Yeah, anybody else maybe do that at first, 1 million, because it's a nicer, rounder number. And well, it would be nice because I think a lot of us work with numbers like this. In a variety of businesses, you use sort of 1 million as a benchmark sometimes. And so it's really tempting to say, oh, well, this is like 2/3 of $1 million. And there you go, E's the answer in that case. And it's simply a matter of losing track of the 10 million. Changes that. And by the way, if you did use 1 million in that way, but remembered that it's 10 million instead, you might quickly then go to D and say, well, then the real answer should be, only 1/10 of that. But what's a more mathematical way to do it? Anybody write something on paper instead of just kind of thinking it through? Razi, slash and burn. What do you mean slash and burn? Go ahead and grab the mic, Razi.
I just wrote 664,579 over 10 million, and then just started slashing as many zeros as I could, and I ended up with 6 over 100, which is 6.06, because I could see all the answers were the same. So all I needed to get to was something like that. And since I got 6 over 100, that's around 6.6%. And that's answer D.
You'll love that term. Chris, we should change that in the book. The great name for that. Slash corresponding places. So slash off the 1, slash off the 10s in both numbers top and bottom. Effectively, that's shorthand for moving the decimal place over the same number of times top and bottom. And yes, Andrew's making a really good point. Just until you get to 100 in the denominator. You don't want to slash and burn your way all the way till you just have 1 in the denominator. Because if you do that, you get B, which is another trap answer. I'm actually surprised that nobody in this group fell for it. Because 0.066 is the fractional answer, which equates to 6.6%. So there's a fraction versus decimal trick here. The answer is in fact 6.6. Because we see it 6 and a little bit over 100. Yeah, so why is B a trap? If we kept going with the slash and burn, what we would have to do is to put some zeros in front of our 664,000. Put those in there now, just so they line up. And if you keep on slashing until what you have in the denominator is a 1, then you say to yourself, okay, where does the decimal place go? It goes right there. And so that equals 0.00 or 0.06. I think I've messed up where my numbers go here. Line them up incorrectly. There we go. Should go right there with 1 0 in front of the 6. And that's the correct answer if what you're looking for is a fraction, because this is 0.06 over 1. But to convert that to percentages, we have to do this, times 100%. And that's what gives you 6.6%. It's like this. If I asked you what's 1 over 4, everyone would tell me it's 25%. But if you do 1 over 4 and actually do the math, it comes out to 0.25. No one would tell me that that's 0.25% because you sort of know that's too small. But it's the same thing here. You'd have to convert from the fractional form by multiplying, moving that decimal over, and putting percent after it. Danielle, let me know if that was clear. So B is the answer that would be right if there weren't a percent sign there, and that's why that's the trap. There's one other quick method, and Danielle may be sort of getting at it here, and it's this idea of benchmarking. It's sort of a common sense approach. Take percents that are round numbers and nice and easy to use, something like 10%. And you can just see what it should be. Like 10% of 10 million would be 1 million. 1% of 10 million would be 1/10 of that. right, or 100,000. And then all you have to do is compare our number to it. Our number is in between those two, so our answer ought to be between 1 and 10%. All right, give me a smiley face if you guys are okay with this one. All right, cool. Oops, and I meant to cover these up here. All right, give me your answers on this one. All right, so we're not unanimous, but you guys are avoiding the smallest answers. I think A is the giveaway here. Unless one of these things in the product is 0, you're not going to get 0 as your product. So I think that's wise of you guys. And I think you might just sort of estimate what this term is and say, oh, these are all big numbers. You know, it might be big enough, certainly because of the 10 to the 4th, that we're not going to be just at 0.12. What did you do to actually solve this? And I want everybody to respond. So I'm going to change the chat so it goes just to us. Type in what your first step was. This is great. This is great. What you guys are doing is you've almost 50-50 split in this class between two methods. And I've got them up here. So one method is, in fact, I'll clear your answers just to get this out of the way. One method is to distribute the things in this sum across the product. So you do 10 to the 4th times that tiny little number, and then subtract 10 to the 2nd from times that tiny little number. And do the math in two places, right? So you're doing it here and here before you take the difference. The other method was to deal with that subtraction first. So those of you who did this probably expanded out 10 to the 4th and 10 squared and said, okay, what is 10,000 minus 100? And you get 9,900. And then you would do 9,900 times that little tiny number. Which of those two do you guys think is easier? Type in number 1 or 2. Yep, so there's your takeaway on this one. If you were one of the people who dove right into that subtraction and made this somewhat inconvenient number of 9,900, anytime you see a power of 10 times something that's a tiny decimal, some place where a power of 10 could come in really handy, don't fall for the temptation to make this into a different type of number. Keep them in power of 10 form and use them for what they were intended to do, which is moving the decimal place over. So I agree with you guys. Number 1 is way easier. Now, there is kind of a third way to go here, and I was reminded of this method actually recently by a student. I think I had learned it once a long time ago, but it's kind of a neat little trick. If you have like a 2-digit, a repeating decimal like this, 0.12 repeating for a second, where it's right after the decimal place, you can write that as 12 over 99. And it sort of makes sense that it would work out that way, right? Because 12 over 100 would be exactly 0.12. By subtracting by something a little bit less, we guarantee that it's going to be repeating. It's going to be a little bit more than 0.12. And we can play on that here, where we have just 2 more decimal places in front of that. That would occur when you had another 100 in the denominator. So we could write this as 12 over 9,900. And if you realized that, you could put that together with method number 2 and say to yourself, well, 9,900 times 12 over 9,900, well, that conveniently cancels out, doesn't it? But it's a little bit tough to catch that, I think, first time through. And it's probably a pretty rarely applicable rule, but kind of neat. All right, looks like you guys are cool with that one. So let's move on to this one that gave you guys a little bit more trouble. Give me your answers on it. And if you didn't have an answer, just let us know that you got stuck. Go ahead and just type it in. That tells me something too. All right, so just so I know where you guys are, type in what method you tried to solve this one. And I've got it set just to the moderators, so feel free to fire away. What did you try to do even if you got stuck? All right, so interesting approaches. What a lot of them have in common is spotting some commonality between the left and the right. And I just want to circle this to emphasize what some of you guys are typing in. The 15 over the 3, you guys see that maybe and salivate. It's like 5, right? If you could just get a 15 and a 3 there, you'd have a 5 just like on the other side. And 10 to the m over 10 to the k is where we're going to get our m minus k using our exponent rules that when you divide something power to by something to a power, you subtract those exponents. So yeah, let's play on this. Andrew, would you grab the mic and talk about how you tried to make that happen?
So I basically converted this fraction here to 15 times 10 to the negative 4 times 10 to the times 10 over m times 10m to the m divided by 3 times 10 to the negative 2 power times 10k. From there, if you sort of look at those as, I guess, 3 different columns almost, you get 5 times 10 to the negative 2 times 10 to the m minus k power. Once you're at that point, you realize that you have to you basically just have to add the powers of the 10 to the minus 2 plus m minus k to get 7, and that I came up with the answer of 9.
Yeah, this is a really neat way to go. So Andrew's saying if I get a 15 and a 3, I'm halfway there. So I think it makes sense to look at this number and say, how can I put this in terms of 15? The key to doing that correctly is recognizing what would you need to do to the number as it originally appeared to get your 15. You move the decimal place over 4 times, right? But if you're doing that, you're making the number bigger. And we don't want to change the value here. So what we have to do is make some part of this smaller to compensate. You see that idea come up a couple times tonight. So whereas it had been 0.0015 times 1, it wasn't shown there, but times 1, when we move the decimal place over in this part with the 15, we got to take 1 and move the decimal place over back 0.4 decimal places. And you can verify Andrew's math by realizing that, hey, if you did move the decimal place in the 15 over 4 times, you'd be back with the number that we started with. So if you're seeing this, this ninja move, smile for us, because we're halfway there. If if you understand why we did this. And let us know if you're not seeing that. And same kind of thing applies here. 3 times 10 to the minus 2 can be shown to be equivalent to the 0.03. If we move that decimal place back to, well, here we are at 0.03. And so what he's saying is, okay, now I've got my 15 and my 3. Those are going to cancel to give the 5. And then you can just sort of deal with this part, the powers of 10 separately. So he's saying if it's 10 to the minus 4 on top, that's going to be your power, 10 to the minus 4, but subtract the power on the 10 on the bottom. So that's what we're doing here. So it's minus 4 minus minus 2. And that's something that you have to keep track of. Minus minus 2 is like adding, right? So minus 4 plus 2. And ultimately, we're going to write this whole left side as 5 times 10 to the minus 2 times 10 to the m minus k. Now that I've kind of caught up with you on the board, Andrew, walk us home. Go ahead and grab the mic.
Well, from there, I basically combined the base 10s, and so you have 5 times 10 to the negative second power plus m minus k, which equals 5 times 10 to the 7th power. So from there, m minus k, so if you basically just do simple adding and subtraction there, you'll find that m minus k must equal 9 so that so you get a 7.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, we can shave a little bit off here if we recognize that we have the 5 on both sides, so we can just cancel it and just deal with those powers of 10. By exponent rules, we just add the exponents. So it's m minus k minus 2, right? I meant just adding that. And now we have common bases on each side. So if the bases are the same, the exponents must be the same. So m minus k minus 2 equals 7, which means that m minus k equals 9. And that's the right answer. Did anybody do it a different way? Because I suspect some people did. And I'm scanning back to your comments, but raise your hand if you want to speak to that. I think Rosie did it this way. Rosie did it this way, but made a mistake. And I don't want to. I am calling you out, Rosie, because I know you're a strong math person, and this is an error that only happens to the strongest math people. So I've actually got this down here below, roughly the same thing that Andrew walked us through. But I want to show you on here where you could possibly go wrong. If you mistakenly got the signs wrong of this 4 and 2, and say you made those positive, it would carry on through to the end solution. So if I had changed the sign, and I'm going to do that temporarily over here, and accidentally had a plus 2 over here, watch what answer we would have gotten. Instead of getting 9, we would have gotten m minus k equals 5. In other words, instead of 7 plus 2, we would have ended up with 7 minus 2. And this is the trap answer for people who do this approach. All right, there are other ways to go on this one. You guys seem like you're pretty much done with this. What I will throw out there is that you could actually try to plug and chug some numbers. If what you're trying to do is make 15 and 3 on top, what you could do is say, okay, well, if m were 4, so kind of test numbers, m equals 4 makes 15 on top, right? And if k equals 2, that makes 3 on bottom. Smile if you see what I'm talking about. So if m were a power of 4, that would mean we'd move our decimal place over 4, making the 15. And if k were 2, we'd move our decimal place over 2. And so what that tells you is that if m and k are 4 and 2, you'd get 5 over here. But we don't want 5 over here. We want 5 with 7 more zeros. So what that tells us is that m ought to be 7 bigger. So it needs to be 4 plus 7 to sort of change our test numbers. So if m equals 11 and k equals 2, then m minus k equals 9. That's another way to go. And I like this method too because it's sort of the nice wishful thinking method. Turn the problem into something easier temporarily and then see where you can go from there. See how far it gets you. It gets us to a 5 over here. What do we need to do to actually get the number that we're looking for? All right. So our takeaways here are the slash and burn method. Being careful to leave 100 in the denominator anytime you're looking for a percent. Try to remember, percent literally translates to per 100, so leave that 100 down there. You guys like this method of distributing power of 10. It paid off for us a little bit easier than the alternative. And just watch out if you're going to get fancy with decimal placement shifting and accounting for it with powers of 10. Get the sign right when you do it. So a quick double check that this equals the number you started out with, I think is definitely in order. Chris, what do you think? Do we have time for one more set? I'll let you call. All right, he's giving me the go-ahead, so let's do this one. Actually, you know what? Yeah. Yeah, let's do it. All right, this is our last set before break, so let's finish up. Give me a green check if you are almost done or on the last one. All right, where did we struggle on this one? I'll change the polling so it goes to everybody. Type in top, middle, or bottom. Which one did you think was toughest? Middle and bottom, and by the numbers, yeah, middle one is ranked more difficult. I actually find in a lot of classes people find this bottom one more difficult, but you guys seem to split on this. So we'll go very quickly through the first one. Give me your answer, please, as soon as I change the polling. What's your answer here? All right, and you're almost in a complete agreement on this one. B is the right answer. So I'll tell you what I think is the most efficient approach on something like this. Decimal equivalence. So it pays to memorize the common fractions and what the decimal version of it is. Things like quarters, sixths, eighths, and multiples of them will pay off. We can convert every one of these numbers to a decimal fairly quickly. Even this one by benchmarks, right? 13 is just, actually it's 0.5 and a little bit less. And so you can eliminate everything but B. Another way to go, if you sort of narrow it down first and want to verify using some kind of fractional method, is the cross multiplication trick. So let's say we want to see which is bigger, 8/11ths or 2/3. Well, you set them next to each other and you cross multiply down. So 2 times 11, you put the 22 that results over here above where you started. 8 times 3, and you put the 24 that results over here above where you started. And since 24 is greater than 22, that tells you that 8/11ths was greater than 2/3. And what this is basically a shortcut for converting to a common denominator. Because if you did common denominator, you'd end up with 24/33 and 22/33. So these are just the numerators that you would have gotten. Yep. And that's a good way to remember that you're doing it right if you think about what it represents. I've got a picture here. Clear your poll results there. Give me your answer on the second one. Polling your answers now, please. And tell us, why did so many of you find you had trouble with this one? Where did you get stuck? And I want to hear from everybody. What was difficult about it? Yeah, and that's a good point. They do give you a number line. And Chris, remind me, I think it might not have the markings on it. And Ryan's filling in what I thought was difficult as I drew this picture, and maybe my artwork reflects this. It's tough to break it up evenly. I think I put my fifth markings, which are in blue, somewhat neatly and evenly spaced, but it's tough to put the sevenths where they ought to be. Yeah, and I mean, if your picture's not exactly to scale, it's tough to know which of these are going to be closest. I mean, this one looks closest, but maybe that's just because I've drawn something else incorrectly. Now, Andrew, you're saying something about 35th. Grab the mic and talk about that.
Yeah, I'm saying you have to break it out into 35ths because you're sort of multiplying the denominators, and because they're marked off it, I guess if you think about it in terms of, I thought about it as, when do 5 and 7, when do the multiples come closest to each other? And so I thought of it as 20 versus 21 versus, I guess, 0 through 1. And so that's how I came up with my answer of B.
This is awesome. And 35 is the least common multiple of 5 and 7. It's sort of our smart number here. It's the denominator of both of the fractions that we're given, or the multiple of those two denominators. And if you think back about the difficulty I had with the picture, one way to be sure that my picture was to scale is if I actually, drew this on graph paper. I'd have to use 35 blocks on my graph paper to be able to divide evenly. Sevenths would be every 5 blocks, and fifths would be every 7 blocks. And I could then place my markings exactly where they needed to be. Of course, you don't actually have to make that picture, but it's the idea that it gives you some common frame of reference. If you're putting these in 35ths, then you know the 5ths go every 7, and the 7ths go every 5th, and you can list out where those marks would be. Just listing the numbers is enough. And so yeah, you see 20 and 21 are actually our closest two markings. There's 15 and 14, same distance. But since these are in 35ths, B is our answer. So what's the trap answer here? I haven't shown you your choices. Type it in if you see what the trap is. Andrew, you're saying C. So, Amit, why is C the trap?
It's very easy to subtract 1/7 from 1/5, and we have that answer over there. I mean, that's what I did in the first attempt, and then got the correct answer in the second attempt.
Yeah, I think C is the trap because it's the very mathematical approach. And it's correct if you're looking for the distance between the first two markings. But we want the least possible distance between any two markings. So this word any should be your clue to look further, look at later markings. But there's a reason that is up there. Yeah, it is that distance instead of one that's actually closer together. They're not on my picture. Not so on my picture. And Ravi, you're yelling out E, but watch out. Like, I think this is the trap answer because it's one of the markings that you were given. But even a rudimentary picture, not drawn to scale, would be enough to realize that like those 5th markings are going to be kind of cutting into or splitting up my 1/7 markings. They're certainly in between there. D. This is the GMAT writers messing with you. 5 plus 7, so they're playing on people doing completely the wrong math. But again, not completely randomly. Yeah, so Danielle, great question. Without drawing the picture, yeah, I'd do it by writing down the multiple. Yeah. Because ultimately my picture wasn't that helpful because it was not to scale. I don't think you would get that. Certainly no more than 3, but then what you would do is take the least common multiple of all the denominators given, convert every set of markings to that common denominator, and make your list. Oh, okay. So, and yeah, I don't think you'd see it between, say, 0 and 100, although they could do that. All right. Let's take a look at your answers on this one. All right, so this is interesting. Danielle says it's a problem from hell. A few of you didn't put in an answer, so maybe you agree with her. And we see a clear split between A and D. So let me hear from you folks who are going with A, the most popular answer. Why do you think this is greatest? Angela, I haven't heard from you on the mic. Why'd you pick A?
I just guess it's like the smallest denominator among the other options.
All right, smile for us if you saw something, or if you agree with that about what Angela just said, smallest denominator to largest. There is a trend here, and smallest denominator would equate to a large value. Andrew, what do you want to add?
I was basically going to say that I sort of broke the answer choices down into 2 groups. The first being group A and B, and then the second group being C, D, and E. And so in the first group, I basically found that A was larger than B for the sole fact that if you basically divide 6 by 2, it would be 2 to the 3rd. And so A would be larger than B. With the second group, I basically looked at it as sort of the same thing, how there's one more multiple of 2 in the denominator for each one. And so out of those answers, I saw that D was the largest of the 3, and then I just compared those 2 answers to find which I thought was A.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So Angela's cueing us into there's a trend in the denominators. And Andrew's playing on this too, right? If you see something that's similar between the denominators, maybe you can use that as a comparison tool. Now, the only problem with going with A because it has the smallest denominator is that not only do we have sort of a trend from low to high in the denominator, we also have it in the numerator. So you can't necessarily infer that just because the denominator is getting bigger, these fractions are getting smaller, because the numerator is getting bigger at the same time. Maybe it's getting bigger enough to keep these fractions larger. So I think this is kind of a neat way to go, to split them in two. I call this the playoff method, where you sort of eliminate as you go. And it works well on problems where you're looking for either the greatest or the lowest value. So you sort of do a playoff between A and B. And Andrew's getting us started with this. B's got a larger denominator. It's got a smaller numerator. So just based on fraction rules, B is smaller. So we can cross it out, never look at it again. A wins this playoff game. Now we can compare, say, C and D. This was interesting when he noted about there being an extra 2 in the denominator of D. Compare the numerators of C and D, 28 to 62. Type in, everyone, which is bigger, C or D? Okay, so you're all saying D. Type in Y. What did you notice about the relationship between 28 and 62? Yeah, you're using 2 as your comparison tool. You know the denominator is getting bigger by times 2, but you can see by a variety of ways that the numerator is getting bigger by times more than 2. The numerator is getting more big than the denominator is. And so D has to be bigger than C overall. It wins the playoff. Great point. Now compare 62 to 122. Which is bigger, D or E? Type it in. Yep, there you go. D is, again, the bigger one. Because 62 times something a little bit less than 2, I'm going to write that as 2 minus something less than 2, gives you the numerator in E. So E is smaller because the numerator is not getting bigger as fast as the denominator is. So our winners of our playoffs are A and D. Let's look at them down here. I'm going to write them side by side. So D, compare A and D for me. What's the difference in the denominators? And what's the difference in the numerators? Andrew, since you got us on this path, talk us through the comparison of these two.
Well, from there, I just tried to factor it down. So I had 3 over 50 compared to 7 over 125. And then I forget the name of the trick, but I basically cross-multiplied to see which was greater.
Great. So you actually sort of played on the 6 is divisible by 2 thing. I'm going to suggest that we skip that because, as Ronnie's saying, that might be a little bit too tedious. It's kind of convenient that these are these are both in powers of 2s and 5s. I think what we did earlier, where we were looking at just what's the difference, might be faster, because it's an extra 2 and an extra 5. So this denominator is actually 10 times bigger. So what you have to ask yourself is, is 62 more than 10 times bigger than 6? Or, yeah, 10 times bigger than 6, and yeah, it is. So 6 times something greater than 10 is what we're dealing with up top. And so, yeah, D is the winner of this playoff. Yeah, and you run the risk of doing the math wrong when you cancel some of those 2's out of there. Yeah, so D is actually the right answer here. You guys in the minority win this one. An alternative, just to address what Razi's saying, if you're going to do kind of a playoff process, you are inherently going to do multiple checks. A faster way to go would be to make a change to all of the terms at once that's equivalent. For example, if you multiply these all by the same number, you're not going to change their relationship to one another. Like smallest is still going to be smallest, and biggest is still going to be biggest. So a really great number to multiply by, you might try this later, multiply each by the largest denominator, which is 2 to the 4th times 5 to the 3rd. And what you accomplish by doing that is you cancel every denominator, and then you're just comparing the resulting numerator times what was left over. So I'll leave that for you guys to think about. This is a good time for us to take a break. Chris has dropped out. We will resume when he comes back on. So I'll put 5 minutes up on the clock just for break, and we'll hope that he's back by then. That's 5 minutes, but I'm going to extend break by 2 just to figure out what's going on with Chris. He called here, and I am still trying to track him down. I may just go on ahead without him if he's having technical issues, but bear with me for a sec. All right, I just spoke with Chris, and he's at our office and got booted off of his computer. So he tried rebooting, but it looks like he's not able to connect. He's going to try from someone else's computer and see what happens. So we're going to continue on. You're stuck with me for right now. Be kind. I won't necessarily be able to catch as many questions in the chat window without him here, but let's get into verbs. And verbs are very important as they tell you what happens in a sentence. And most important issues about verbs are they tell you what happens and when. So tense is a very, very important issue that gets tested on a lot of questions. And of course, the issue of when can be somewhat complicated. Past, present, and future are the most straightforward of relationships. But what about when there's more than one thing happening? What's the relationship in time between two events? There are verb tenses for that. The other thing that crops up on the GMAT is the issue of voice. Now, voice is a grammar term that basically means who's doing the action. When the subject is actively doing something, it's an active voice. But when the action is being done to the subject, then it's passive voice because the subject is passive in that case. We'll see that in action tonight. So I'm going to give you a minute and 15 for this one. All right, get those answers in. Danielle, Ganesh, you're the holdouts on me. And we are almost unanimous. Ryan, I'm going to call on you. We'll work our way up from the bottom here. Ryan, what was a useful split to you, and how did you arrive at your answer?
Okay, for me the split was 3-2. A and B are associated, C, D, and E are associate. So I got rid of A and B because associated did not match. And then after I did that, I looked at C, D, and E. Then let's see. You got they required, they have required, and they require. They required and they have required does not make sense in this case. So I went with E, which is they require, and that matches everything.
Yeah, and you mentioned this issue of matching. We've seen this before, obviously, when we did parallelism, signaled by words like and this is definitely parallelism between verb tenses. You know that you need the same tense if there's no explicit reason given for changing tense. And since these two verbs, exercise and associate, have the same subject, all the more reason that they ought to match. So, yeah, absolutely, associated is out the window. And from there, you have two more verbs. There's required, have required, and require, and then there's gain and will gain. Now, you actually could change tense between exercise and associated in the if clause, and switch to another tense with will require and will gain. For example, if something happens in the present, you might make a prediction. Then something else will happen in the future. So it's not automatically the case that will gain is wrong, but will gain certainly does have to match the tense of required. So we don't have will required offered to us. It happens to be that all four of these then are the same tense, and E is the right answer. There's a minor split at the end, more quickly than do, quicker than do. So there's quicker versus quickly, and then do versus just plain old than. It's appropriately quickly because it describes the weight gain, and that's an adverb. You also don't need the do to make the comparison clear. So it's a bit of a red herring split, but it's okay to not have it here in E. You guys seem pretty solid on this one. So that's good. It is our first rule. Anytime you see a tense, you want to keep them consistent, certainly if they share a subject. Only switch tenses if they give you some indication that the tenses ought to change. And they'll make it very clear if that's the case. Try this one out. All right, last call for answers. And I'll show you what we've got. Split between B and A. So you guys are avoiding flourishing. Hang on a second, I'll move that out of the way. Type in for me, why not flourishing? Everyone seems to dislike that one, that option. What was your reason? Okay, future. Sometimes people say present. Yeah, present. Flourishing now. The flowers are flourishing. Yeah, but either way, it's not an ancient civilization. There's the way the GMAT writers tell you what this timeline ought to be. Has to be past, right? So we can get rid of that. I'm going to come back to the issue of flourishing because it may not be that straightforward, but it works as a good eliminator here. So our other split that I want to talk about is flourished or had flourished. You guys exactly split on this. Brooks, would you grab the mic and tell us why you went with flourished?
I went with flourished just because I thought had flourished was too wordy. I thought that flourished gave past tense without adding any extra words.
Yeah, that's a great rule of thumb. If there's like an extra helping verb thrown in there, that's what that had is. And you can't figure out why it's there and the meaning is correct without it, then, you know, go with the shorter version. So A is actually the right answer in this case. We don't need the had. We'll talk later about when you will need the had. And I wanted just to note kind of a neat little thing. When you have something like had flourished and a comparison term like this at the same time as, and then you later say had, it's like the flourished is implied again. In other words, at the same time others had flourished. And incidentally, that's the reason that C is wrong, because there is a had flourished in there as well. We don't necessarily see why we need the had, so let's get rid of it. Can anybody name a different split here? Catherine, we're about to talk about what the had does. Happen before what? Maybe complete your sentence. Because flourished gets across the idea that it happened before now, right? That's Brooks' point. Flourished in the past tense is right. Hey, Catherine, go ahead and grab the mic.
Sorry, I'm a little confused because the way I read it, and I flip-flop between A and B, is that the salt deposits and moisture threaten to destroy the Mohenjo-Daro excavation in Pakistan, so that's present, which is the site of an ancient civilization that had flourished, which means that it happened before, but maybe had is, if you're talking about salt deposits and moisture, had, well, I don't know if it's past, and then had flourished would be, you know, even before the past. So I'm a little confused, but that's where the confusion is coming from.
I hear ya. No, what you said is actually right. We want to say had flourished if it had flourished before something else, but that something else has to be in the past. And there's only one other action here. This is the present tense. We don't need a special tense to say to say that something happened before the present because we have the past tense to get that job done. So yeah, we can't really justify it if our only other verb is present tense. So A is the right choice. There's another minor split here, and Ganesh, I'm about to talk about flourishing again. And the split is whether you have those or whether you have the civilization. There's an unclear pronoun usage if you say those. There's nothing for that to refer to. Civilizations is what they mean, but civilizations aren't in there. Now, why is flourishing wrong? I want to say a little bit more about that form in just a moment. But for now, our little takeaway is just that you should only use that extra helping verb had in the instance that Catherine was alluding to, something happening before something else in the past. That's a perfect tense, and it's used for special cases. If you don't have a special case like that, stick with the simple tense. So the simple tense is just plain old flourished in the past. Now, flourishing is kind of tricky because ing words don't always behave as verbs. A lot of people see ing and think, oh, it's a verb. Not necessarily. They actually can be 4 different types of things. They're a verb if they've got a helping verb of being along with them. Something like are or am. I am eating. I'm doing it right now. This is called the progressive tense, where it's ongoing. And the helping verb determines, when is the action ongoing. Since am is present tense, this is an ongoing moment, ongoing thing presently. If I was eating a hot dog, it was ongoing in the past. So that's verb form. But unless you have that helping verb of being, it's going to play, an ing word can play these other roles. So noun is one way, right? Gerund is what this is called. Eating is like the activity. It's a thing in this sentence, and the actual verb here is id. Another way that you'll see it is in modifier form, and there's actually 2 ways that happens, either as an adjective or as an adverb. The guy eating the hot dog. Now, there is somewhat of a timeline implied even when this is used as an adjective, because the guy is eating the hot dog. The ing is sort of implying that this is happening now. And that's actually what we had on this example. We had the ancient civilization flourishing. Well, flourishing there is an adjective modifying the civilization, but it still implies a bit of present tense-ness, even though it's technically not a tensed verb. So I think your reason for getting rid of this because it's too current sounding was reasonable here. Give a smile if you're clear on that. But it's technically not a verb. Okay, great. And then you'll see it sometimes as an adverb, but that's when it follows a comma. It describes how the action in the previous clause was done. For example, I sat, how was I sitting in this case? Questions on this? Verb plus be, present perfect. Ryan, are you asking about this case? Just grab the mic or let me know. Yeah, this one is not a perfect tense. You'll see these called progressive. So you'll see like present progressive, past progressive. Which progressive tense it is depends on the tense of this helping verb. But the ing basically makes it an ongoing thing. So let me know if that addresses your question. We're about to see past perfect and present perfect. So we'll see those in action. All right, let's move to this example. Minute 15. All right, last call for answers. All right, here's what we have. It's blocking us, but we're mostly going with B, smattering of other answers. So let me call on Ganesh on this one. Ganesh, you went with B with the majority. What were your splits? Nope, we couldn't hear you. I'm going to come back to you on something else. Rosie, I'm going to throw that to you. You picked B as well.
First were some buildings versus last year. I'm starting the sentence with last year versus some buildings. And then I chose to start with some buildings last year. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So the first three, some of the buildings that were destroyed were, or last year were, or last year have been. Last year have been. Those are the other splits. And I went with had been because that kind of describes that the buildings were constructed in violation of the city building code, so they had been constructed prior to the earthquake. So it's like describing kind of a past action. And so I kind of narrowed it down and felt like had been made the most sense, and then chose between trying to make a decision between B and E, and felt as though B kind of sounded a lot better than E did.
All right, great job on the verb split there. At the end, it's all about the tense, so you have to think about what the timeline is, and this is what Catherine was leading us to when she was thinking about had flourished, and when would you be able to use that correctly. You use this particular tense, had been constructed, only if you have two things happening in the past, and we have that here. The buildings were built, later on they were destroyed, but all of that happened before the present moment. And so we need had been constructed here. If we went with choice A, as written, the tenses are the same. That's parallel, right? Were constructed and were destroyed. But that parallelism is bad here because it implies a strange meaning. It implies that those things happen concurrently. We need different tenses here because they logically happened in order. Is everybody clear on why we need had been constructed? You can smile if so. And on this following slide, I'll show you how we make that that particular tense, or how we set it up. Past moment earlier than something else. So that's your past perfect tense. And the more recent event is the simple past. You make the past perfect by putting had and in front of the past participle of the verb, which usually ends in an ed. Not always. It's not I had knowed him, it's I had known him. So there are some irregular verbs that are worth reviewing in the book. But you can think of the past perfect as like the super past, because it's more past than past. And so you add this extra past tense word to make that happen. And the only other difference, now that we've eliminated A, C, and D based on tense, is what Rosie mentioned earlier. Whether we begin with some buildings or whether we begin with last year. And it has more to do with the placement of last year than anything. Rosie, you said it sounds better in B. Why does it sound better? What is the implication of the changed placement of that phrase?
Well, it's the earthquake that happened last year, but So in B, it clearly indicates that the earthquake happened last year, but in E, it would say that we don't really know when the earthquake happened. So it says last year some of the buildings that were destroyed or heavily damaged in the earthquake. We don't know when the earthquake happened, so this kind of indicates that last year was when the buildings that had been destroyed or damaged were built.
Yeah, and I like the way Ganesh is putting that too, right? Which is more reasonable? Did the construction happen last year or did the earthquake happen last year? This is something we alluded to earlier when we talked about modifiers, and when they change the placement of a time or place modifier, be on the lookout for meaning issues. This is where this is cropping up. Earthquake last year, very clear. It is the earthquake that happened last year. But in E, earthquake is in this modifying phrase. See this relative clause describing the buildings. So last year actually modifies the entire core of the sentence, the subject and the main verb, which is here, had been constructed. It implies the construction was what happened last year. So for meaning reasons, E is out. B is the right answer. All right. So that's what we are taking away from this one. Oh yeah, Catherine, good eye. There is a minor split here, and I almost didn't mention it because I'm kind of agnostic about splits like this. The official guide cites this as a good split. It says that it doesn't make sense that buildings would be destroyed and damaged. It's one or the other. But I could see myself wasting a lot of time thinking about, well, maybe they could be destroyed and then damaged. So I myself would steer clear of a split like that unless it were really grammar driven. Because I get bogged down in some of meaning issues. I find and and or are sometimes very similar. But if you used it, great. I think it's a valid split to use. All right, so our rule for verbs that we're walking away with is past perfect exists for a reason. We now know what that reason is. If there are two past actions, you use this one to indicate which one happened first. And by the way, one quick check to see that you're using this past perfect correctly is scan and see if there are any other verbs in the sentence. You can never use past perfect as the only action in a sentence because there's no need for it. If you're just talking about something that happened in the past and there was only one thing, well, then you say, she walked. Use the simple past. So this demands at least two verbs in this sentence. Let's keep moving. Give me your answer on this one. All right, Catherine, talk us through your thought process on this one.
I focused on the first split was had elected or have elected. And in that case, since it said a recent study has found that within the past few years, many doctors, I wanted it to be essentially the same time frame, so I kept with have and didn't go with A or B. And then it's really the difference between, well, the next split was retiring or to retire. And I actually went with to retire because I also liked how, with the choices between facing and face, it says you have elected to retire early rather than to face the threats of lawsuit. Now, I don't know if that's fully correct, but that's what I went with. So I went with E.
Yeah, I really like on this later split that you notice that there's a need for parallelism. This split between instead of or rather than, people ask about this a lot. I've heard rules about when you should use which phrase, but I've never seen them actually be necessary. In fact, the official guide doesn't even mention this split. except to say that both phrases require parallelism between the two things. So you can get rid of D because there's a mismatch between to retire and facing. Catherine's right, though. In a choice between to retire and to face versus retiring and facing, to retire is what we want. Partly that's idiom. You know, have elected to do something is the way we say this. But the other reason is that they're trying to use this ing word as kind of a noun. The doctors have elected something. There's a better noun form for this thing. They have elected retirement. And since retirement exists as an alternative, the GMAT rejects retiring in that role. But let's look at have elected. Catherine gave us a great reason. This has found indicates that things are sort of presently going on. Does anybody see any other words here that are clues that we need to have elected? Just type them in real quick. Because I will play devil's advocate a bit and say that even if this said a recent study found, that would be close enough to still use have elected. I mean, yeah, face is on go. Well, it's not tense. It's face is actually an infinitive, which is sort of tense-free. You could say to face in the past or to face in the future. Yeah, within the past few years, as Catherine and Danielle are seeing, what you'll often see indicating the need for this present perfect tense, which is what have elected is some kind of timing phrase. For the past few weeks, in the last month, something like that will be found elsewhere in the sentence. And Ganesh is saying, yeah, had elected could be used to say that the doctors had elected to do something before. But watch out, it has to be something that happened before something that has already happened. The study is recent, and it's still sort of going on. There is no other past action to justify using had elected. Yeah. So I think it's a misuse here unless you somehow changed this to past tense. And so that's our little introduction to present perfect. It's used for actions that are still going on or still in effect. The doctors are still electing, and they started to do so in the past, but it's still true that doctors are electing to retire. And you create it with a present tense helping verb, either have or has, depending on the number of your subject, plural versus singular, and then the past participle again. So I'll pause here while you guys take some notes, if necessary. Let me know if you've got questions. And just to go back to the choices, it was in fact E. Have elected to retire. Ganesh is asking on the side here, sort of what comes before what. Roughly speaking, what you're writing is appropriate order. Had been would be like an earlier past action. Has been means sort of ongoing up to the present moment. Eating is in the present moment, and will be eating would be in the future. But watch out. Some of these tenses, the perfect tenses in particular, namely that past perfect, can't be used just on its own, and it can't be used, for example, in a sentence where we say something like this: he had been eating. He had been eating and will eat tomorrow. We can't really justify the use of the past perfect here because it's not showing that he had been eating before something else in the past. The only other verb here is future tense. So to use past perfect correctly, you only use with the past tense. Okay, never on its own or just with other tenses. So Ganesh, let me know if that addresses that for you. But your timeline is roughly correct. Okay, great. I'm going to plot on through here. So that's the last of our verb tense rules. Use present perfect for ongoing actions, or things that started in the past but are true up to the moment or still going on. Okay, it's slightly different from a present progressive, like she is walking, because it indicated that it did in fact start before. All right, now we're going to get into the issue of voice and do this rather quickly. There's a rule of thumb more than anything. It's not so much a grammar rule, that active voice is preferred. And the simple reason is that it's more concise. So, I ate the pizza only requires one verb. Whereas if you switch to the passive voice, you add verbs of being, and you might even add the word by. The pizza didn't do something. It was acted upon by someone else. So you'll often have like a phrase that indicates who actually did the eating. And that's longer, of course. So the GMAT prefers the shorter way, but passive voice exists for a reason. So we're about to see what those reasons are. That said, if you can't justify the passive voice and the answer choices are identical other than this, pick the active voice. Let's look at this example. I'll give you a minute 15. All right, let's call on answers, and we have two choices represented. They are B and D. Let's see, Danielle, I haven't heard from you in a while, so why don't you talk about what you saw as splits that were useful?
Well, first I was thinking of I usually just do verbal by my sort of intuition, but I think the split that I was thinking at first was where the first was placed. Where first aired, where first aired, where aired first, where it first aired on using radio first. And I thought where first aired, it had to be where first aired, because I'm not sure why, but I just felt like it had to be where first aired because it changes the meaning. I'm just not quite sure how to explain it. And then I split between A and B. They had moved versus they were moved, and I guess. Oh, well, I was thinking of active or passive voice, but I chose B. I'm not sure why. I just don't have a good way of explaining it.
Yeah, let's talk about that last split first. Had moved and were moved. The difference is active or passive. If something had moved, it moved itself, right? You can imagine it like wiggling around. So that's active voice. And if something were moved, they were moved, it would be by someone, right? So that is passive voice. So the question really is here, did the soap operas move themselves, or did someone move the soap operas? And this is how the GMAT makes sort of an esoteric grammar choice kind of clear. It just simply doesn't make sense that the soap operas move themselves. Someone would have to do it, right? Like a programming director. And so we want the passive voice. B is the correct choice for that reason. We need the passive voice in that were first aired by someone. And so we see that in A, B, C, and D, whereas E has aired in the active voice. So that's wrong. But you have that verb after the comma as well. So we can get rid of had moved, moving, actively moving. They moved is active. In E we've got passive, but it's already got a mismatch between active and passive. So we have parallelism here between two passive verbs. And it's funny that, Danielle, you're mentioning that that there's this tendency among newspaper headline writers lately, or news people, to say things like, the city saw an improvement in crime statistics, as if the city can actively see something. It technically isn't right. It doesn't make sense. Like, soap operas moved to another time slot. No, they didn't. Someone moved them. I think what you're seeing there is like, you know, maybe an attempt to make things a little bit more lively and, yeah, personification. But it's really not grammatically appropriate. And on the GMAT, we're going to stick with grammatically appropriate. And Andrew, I think, helped us out with this placement of first. I just kind of drew out arrows here. They aired first, first aired. What happened first? It was the airing. But when you say first on evening radio, as he's saying, it's the first to show up in maybe the evening lineup. But B correctly implies that that was, in the 1920s, that was the first time they ever aired, ever. Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely permitted. Even though were aired is the verb here, you can get away with doing, putting a word like first, a modifier in between them. It is not similar to that rule about split infinitives. In fact, I think we've seen a question earlier where we were given have often looked. Visitors to the park have often looked up. And there they're inserting an often in between those two parts of the verb. Yep, totally okay to do. And so that's our verb rule number 2. Pick passive when you have to, when active just doesn't make sense. One way you'll see that is when you have to maintain parallelism. We saw that in this question, were aired and were moved. And when the choices themselves make using active wrong, either because soap operas can't do something themselves, or if they tell you that someone else did the action. In that case, stick with passive voice. It's not the most common thing to crop up, but look for it in the absence of other issues. So real quick, here's a summary. I'll pause here. Just give me a green check when you're all set on this slide. I don't want you to miss any in your notes, but I do want to keep going. Yeah, Rosie, no problem. I knew your internet cut out. The answer to the last one was B. So I'll hop back there just a moment for you. It was B. There you go. And I'll put that summary slide back up for everyone else. Just make sure you give me a green check on this. When you're ready. And I've got most of those green checks in. We'll come back to this if you guys need to see it again, but it is in the book. So one other thing I wanted to sort of direct your attention to before you do the reading this week. There are other issues that are discussed in more detail in the book. The strategy guide covers those in more detail than we could here. Things like subjunctive mood, when you have bossy verbs, or when you're talking about wishes, or trying to exert influence or express a desire. There's also several discussions about tense sequence, what sort of logical order is appropriate. They'll talk about various cases for that. If-then statements fall into that category, I think. And then sort of things related to verbs that aren't quite verbs. I touched on it with the ing, but other things like to go. It's not technically a tensed verb, but it is in the verb family. So read up on these and all the ways those can be tested. And our next thing on the agenda is critical reasoning. So we're going to talk about drawing a conclusion in the last part of class tonight. It should be pretty fun. I'm going to put up an example here, and a little bit different from usual. What I want you to do, without seeing answer choices, is to anticipate what those choices might be. So we're looking for some conclusion that could be drawn from this argument. Pretend you're reading this in the newspaper. Think about what the author might be building, what point the author might be building up to. And I'll give you guys a couple minutes to do that. Type them in when you've got them. All right, so I'm seeing some suggestions in here, just to remind you guys what we're doing. Please type in, what would you conclude? Put it in the chat window, and I'll try to summarize them up on the board. All right, these are great. Advocacy about what we should do in response to these statements, whether you should use aspirin or not. Things that address, statements that address more of the motivation, like fevers are beneficial. Maybe looking at negative alternatives, as Ryan's suggesting. Using aspirin can make you sicker. And I know I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. Razi, looking at maybe the effects, aspirin sales declining. Declined. Let's put it declining. Have we missed anything? Ganesh addressing other effects of the aspirin. I won't summarize them all. All right, so I've had you fill in the blanks. Let me show you now what the actual choices are. Take a minute and a half to pick one. All right, last call for answers on this one. And I'm going to show you what we've got. Pretty much neck and neck between two choices. B and C appealed to you all the most. Smile if you did some sort of diagram on this one. And thumbs down if you approached it a different way. Okay, so you guys are leaning not towards the diagramming. All right, so let me hear from somebody here. Brooks, you were doing a thumbs down. Brooks, how did you approach it instead?
I approached it to kind of see which answer choice was in line with the, you know, what I thought the conclusion was going to be. So I picked B because my first thought was it was going to be that the body, if left alone, would heal itself or would work towards healing itself. So B was appealing to me because it was something that sort of went in line with that insofar as aspirin might interfere with the body actually healing itself.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I wanted to take that chance to hop back here and point out that, like, some of the things that we anticipated as possible conclusions, things like using aspirin can make you sicker, or that it has some negative effects, or that fevers that the aspirin are supposed to be addressing are actually beneficial. I think we were anticipating choices like B and C that say, yeah, maybe aspirin can prolong illness, and they both use these words, fighting some diseases, fighting some illness, and how aspirin might interfere with that. So just give a smile if you were like Brooks, sort of drawn to choices that said something in that ballpark. Because after all, that sort of seems like what they're saying up here. Yeah, so it's noteworthy that you guys split so evenly on these two choices, because what that implies is that just going by what seems to be saying something most in agreement with what this feels like can lead you to the wrong answer. So we'll talk about how to decide between these two, because they both have good things going for it. Amit, you're saying you switched. I'm going to ask you in a little bit why you switched, and feel free to type it in. But why did you guys, by and large, avoid the other choices? What's wrong with them? Raise your hand if you can address what's wrong with A, D, or E. Riley's saying their assumption too definitive, Catherine says. All right, let me hear and John Ross saying E is too extreme. Ganesh says comfort's irrelevant. Rosie, what do you think they're assuming? And after Rosie addresses that, Catherine, what do you think they're being too definitive about?
And with D, when I was thinking assumptions, I felt like D was kind of an assumption because it says the more white blood cells a patient's body produces, the less severe patient's illness will be. It's assuming that white blood cells are the only relief a patient would have with regard to how severe the illness will or will not be.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, Catherine, we could. Go ahead and grab the mic again.
I actually think when I was saying too definitive, it was more like an assumption that's a bit too bold because kind of along the same lines, the more white blood cells in the body produces, the less the patient's illness will be. It just seems a little overextensive for the fact that it's only white blood cells that they're talking about. Since the paragraph begins with although, it seems like A isn't really where the author is going. And then for E, the focus of modern medicine is inhibiting the growth. It just, again, seems a little too definitive or maybe too broad is a better description. So those were my thoughts.
Yeah, this was great. You guys are picking up on the way they craft wrong answers. They say things that may even be true, but aren't supportable. They either go too far, or they get off topic a little bit, as I think they're doing with this focus of modern medicine business. That sort of gets off the topic of aspirin specifically. And I want to give you a quick run through these choices. If you guys skip the diagram, I won't focus on the diagram too much, but you could have diagrammed here. Most notably, there's no conclusion. It's all premises, and furthermore, they're all sort of working to the same end. So we don't have any premises over here on the other side. What you want to look for in an effective choice on this type of question is something that not only meets the spirit of the argument up above, but also the language. You should be able to support every word in the choice by what is given to you up above. And for example, A, while it sounds reasonable, they even tell us that aspirin is an effective painkiller, which would alleviate pain. The fact that pain and discomfort of many illnesses isn't supported by the premise given up here, which only tells us that it eliminates moderate fever. A is not supported by the argument itself. Okay, so there's a mismatch here. Now you guys, a lot of you liked B, this fighting some diseases. But check out what really matches so nicely. Not only that, eliminating moderate fever was supported by the premise, and this part about helping and fighting diseases is supported by this part in blue. So it does turn out that B is the right answer. Those of you who picked C were partially right. Fighting some illnesses, right? Wait a minute, why isn't this highlighted? What is different here? Why isn't this tail part of this choice supported by this statement? Raise your hand if you can tell me why. Danielle, go for it.
I actually first chose C, but because of that I realized it had to be B, because that's making like a logical leap. It's not, aspirin doesn't directly inhibit the growth of white blood cells, it's the moderate fever that does. So, I mean, while that may very well be true, in reality you can't really conclude that.
Yeah, it says in the premise a moderate fever stimulates the activities of the white blood cells. And the aspirin affects the fever, but it doesn't tell us that there's a direct link between what the aspirin does and what happens to the white blood cells. The fever is sort of the middle factor there. I think that was well put by Danielle. You can't really support this statement from what's given here. Yeah, the fever inhibits. I got what you meant. The fever stimulates, and the aspirin addresses the fever. Here they're sort of saying the aspirin does something directly to the white blood cells, and you got that point across quite well. I think even though this says the same words at the end of C, there's some red flag word here, which are necessary for fighting some illnesses. They sort of say that, but not quite outright. They say disease-fighting white blood cells, but they don't go so far in the argument to say the white blood cells are absolutely necessary. So I think this part isn't completely supported either. Smile if you're buying into that. And the rest are wrong for the reasons that you've already given. So I think the lesson here is you can sometimes anticipate a choice, but even when you do, there may be two that are very seem very similar to it. So in making that last minute decision between the remaining two answers, you've got to be really picky about the words. And what you should do is sort of rephrase the question in your head this way. I'm even going to write it on this screen. As soon as you see a question that says, which of the following is most supported, just say, which can I prove? Because you should be able to prove the correct choice with the argument up above. And yeah, Ganesh, we can prove B because these green words are exactly proven by the statements up above. Okay. All right. So that's where we'll end tonight. We'll push the prep for the GMAT stuff till next week when Chris will rejoin us. Sorry about the technical issues tonight and for having you guys be stuck with me the whole time. Maybe you'll hear more from Chris next week to make up for that. But next week we've got geometry on tap for you. Have your geometry book ready. It's probably a good idea to create a little cheat sheet for yourself of formulas. And we'll look forward to seeing you then. I'll stick around if you guys have questions, but you're free to go. Good night. Oh, and just so I'm not omitting anything, there is a summary here, and I'll put this up as you guys are filing out. I meant to mention this. You're going to be looking for an answer you can prove, which basically boils down to choosing a conclusion that sticks close to what was said in the premises. You're looking basically for a rephrase of what they've already told you. So avoid any extreme words that get you off topic or say more than the original argument did. Choose the argument that's sort of bland. It shouldn't be obvious necessarily that it's right, but it should be sort of seem redundant with the argument up above. Something easy to prove is what we need. All right, guys. Ganesh has a question. I want to hop off of this slide onto something else. But I want to see if anybody else has questions in mind. I see, Catherine, you do. Give me a green check if you're just hanging around to see what others ask. And give a red X if you've got a question of your own. All right, so I've got a few questions from you guys. Okay, so let's see. Catherine, is yours administrative in nature? All right, why don't we do that one first? And Brooks, you're looking for yours, so Catherine, you go first, then we'll move to Ganesh.
Mine was just a really quick question that since I've missed a couple classes, for homework, is it better to go with what is assigned now, or is it better to go with kind of catching up on some different of the classes that I've missed and the homework that I've missed?
That's a great question. I'm glad you're asking it because I'm sure other people have been in this situation to one degree or another. Work on the homework for next time, so be prepared for next class and worry about making up what you missed later on. All right, cool. And let's see, Ganesh, you had a question about this one. Let me move here. So this one was about the placement of first. There's another sort of minor split here. I texted this to you privately. There's a difference between in the evening or on evening radio. So there's the order of those two phrases as well that sort of affects the meaning as in addition. What I'll say about the first is you can think about this as a modifier. What was first? It modifies the thing that happened that follows. So when you say first aired, it's the action of airing that happened first. They first aired during these times. In other words, that's the first time they were played on the air. When first is followed by a prepositional phrase, it is that it first appeared on evening radio then, or its first appearance in this place. They aired first on evening radio, meaning maybe first in the evening at the 8 o'clock slot before the other programs did. First in the evening may be roughly the same thing, and when first precedes this phrase in the 1920s, it means this was the first decade when they first appeared, not in the 1910s. Does that help at all? If you didn't know that passive voice was required, you'd have a hard time doing this one efficiently. So you're asking about moving specifically. This is actually active in nature, so we eliminated this because of voice. Active versus passive is the most efficient way to go here. I think that you could probably back into the answer by means of all these other splits, but it might not get you all the way, and it would be a little bit more time consuming. So what I'll offer to you is just, practice with active versus passive. And one of the things you want to develop as a test taker is a sense for which splits are easier. Anytime you see a straight up and down split, like verb tense, one verb tense versus another, or one verb voice versus another, that's very grammar driven, and you should look into what else in the sentence tells you what that choice should be. Here it's the fact that the subject is something that has to be demands a passive voice verb.